The baby wouldn't stop crying. Dante had been screaming for 40 minutes straight. 40 minutes. The private charter jet cut through the dark sky somewhere between Miami and New York, and every single person on board had already tried everything. The bottle, the pacifier, the rocking. Nothing landed. Nothing held. Cale sat near the back of the plane, hands moving on autopilot, folding tiny onesies into a soft leather bag. His fingers kept moving even when his mind had started to drift. Fold. Stack. Press. The motion kept him steady. Dante's cries filled the cabin like a siren that couldn't find its off switch, and Cale told himself, just breathe. Just keep breathing. His phone sat face up on the seat beside him. It lit up. A call. Incoming. Rafe's name across the screen. But Cale hadn't answered it. The line just opened. Static first. Then the unmistakable bass of Rafe's voice cutting through the hum of the aircraft engine on the other end. After the pup is born, we'll relocate him. Cale's hands stopped. He won't stay in the main estate. The onesie slipped from his fingers. Small, white, soft. It hit the floor of the jet and Cale didn't pick it up. Relocate. The word moved through him slow and deliberate, like cold water filling a room from the bottom up. He sat completely still. Dante was still crying somewhere near the front of the cabin. The engines hummed. Someone's heels clicked against the aisle. The whole world kept moving, and Cale could not move at all. Then Tycho's voice. Lower. Almost bored. He won't fight it. A pause. Soren's voice next. He's too soft for this world. Too soft. Cale exhaled through his nose. Slowly, like releasing something he'd been holding for months. He reached down, picked up the onesie, and folded it with both hands. Precise. Careful. He placed it back on top of the stack. Then he looked out the small oval window into the black nothing beyond the glass. Too soft. That word should have made him angry. Didn't. What it did was worse. It confirmed something he had been pushing to the edge of his thoughts for the better part of a year. Something he kept stepping around. Something he kept finding reasons to explain away. Rafe hadn't said those words like he was insulting Cale in private. He said them like he was stating a fact. A logistical detail in a larger plan. Like Cale and the baby were variables in an equation. Factors to manage rather than people to love. Dante's crying began to soften near the front of the cabin. One of the attendants must have found the right rhythm. The quiet crept back in, and the quiet was somehow worse. Cale pressed his palm flat against the folded clothes. He thought about the last 6 months. The meetings he wasn't invited into. The calls that ended the moment he walked into a room. The way Rafe would look at Tycho across a table when a decision was being made and Cale was sitting right there. Not exclusion you could point to. Nothing clean enough to call out loud. Just a slow, steady pattern of being managed. The phone line had gone quiet on the other end. They'd moved on to something else. Business. A name he didn't recognize. He picked up the phone and ended the call. He sat back, looked at Dante's small travel bag across the aisle. It had a cartoon bear embroidered on the front that Cale had chosen himself. Relocate him. The plane began its descent toward New York. Hi viewers, have you ever overheard something that completely changed how you saw your own life in an instant? He didn't cry. He didn't call anyone. He just sat there with that one word looping in the back of his mind, folding the last of the baby clothes one by one. And when the wheels touched the runway, Cale already knew. Whatever he had believed this life was, he had been wrong. The only question left was what he was going to do about it. There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside a house full of people. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind you sink into after a long day. The kind where you can feel every conversation happening without you. Where the warmth in the room shifts just slightly whenever you walk in. Where you notice, not because anyone is cruel enough to say it, but because you are paying attention. Cale had been paying attention for months. It started with small things. Easy to dismiss. The weekly security briefing that used to include him stopped including him after the second trimester. Rafe said it was because of stress. You don't need that weight right now. It sounded like protection. At the time, Kale let it land that way. Then there were the evenings Tycho would come home from council meetings and go straight to Rafe's office. Door closed. An hour would pass. Sometimes two. They'd come out relaxed, papers tucked under arms. And when Kale asked how the meeting went, the answer was always some version of handled. Never what was handled. Never why his input hadn't been considered. He remembered one Thursday in particular. He had walked into the East Wing study and found Rafe and Tycho and Soren all standing around the wide oak desk. A map spread out between them, voices low. He'd knocked on the open door. All three turned. And in the half-second before anyone spoke, he saw it. Tycho's eyes moved to Rafe. Quick check. Like asking, how much does he get to know? Rafe had smiled. Just logistics. Come in. But the map had already been folded by the time Kale crossed the room. He hadn't called it what it was then. He found reasons. Pregnancy was a sensitive time. The Empire had real threats. His safety mattered to them. That's why they kept things close. He believed that. Or he made himself believe it, which is a different thing entirely. Now, 40,000 feet of descent later, the memory felt different. It didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like preparation. Like they had been slowly, quietly building a version of this life that made sense with him inside it, but only in a specific, limited role. Present but peripheral. Loved, but conditionally. Like furniture that held real sentimental value but still needed to stay in its corner of the room. Dante stirred in Kale's arms as the car moved through the city toward the estate. The baby made small sounds, not crying, just aware. Kale pressed his lips to the top of Dante's head and said nothing. He thought about Tycho's glances. All of them, stacked up now in his memory like a deck of cards finally shown face up. That look in the study. The way Tycho had pulled back the chair at dinner last spring. Not to include Kale, but to make room while simultaneously steering conversation away. Every glance had a direction to it. Always redirecting. Always adjusting. Kale hadn't been paranoid. He had just been too willing to give the benefit of the doubt. The car pulled through the estate gates. Soren met them at the door. Warm face. Easy smile. Welcome back. He kissed Kale's forehead. Held his elbow as he stepped inside. Genuine warmth. That was the complicated part. These were not cold men. They were not unkind in ways that showed. That's what made it so hard to name. You can love someone and still diminish them. You can care about a person and still have quietly decided what their limits are. Kale walked through the front door and handed Dante to Soren, watching the way Soren's whole posture softened around the baby. Real. That was real. He didn't question their love for Dante. What he questioned now, quietly, carefully, was what that love was actually going to look like once the four walls of this estate made the decisions. He walked upstairs alone. He sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room. Not the shared suite. He'd moved there 3 weeks ago, quietly, without explanation, and none of them had asked, and looked at his hands. Should he leave now? Or wait? And find out how deep this ran? The answer didn't come that night. But the question didn't leave either. 6 months ago, Kale had been sent away. Not exiled. That's not the word Rafe used. He used protected. He used temporary. He said the threat was credible and the safest option was a private property in coastal Georgia. Staff he trusted, full security detail, everything Kale needed. He said it with conviction. He said it with his hand on the side of Kale's face. Kale had believed him. He'd spent 6 months in that house, watching the water, carrying a baby that grew heavier every week, alone except for the staff, waiting for the threat to pass, waiting for the phone calls that got shorter and further apart, waiting for Rafe to come back and say it was over. What he didn't know, what nobody told him, was why he'd really been sent. The transport route. 3 months before Dante was born, a protected convoy carrying critical documents was compromised. The route had been leaked. 4 men from the inner circle were injured. Kale's name was on it. He didn't know that until later. He only knew that Rafe had grown distant, that the calls stopped feeling like conversations and started feeling like check-ins. that there was a specific absence in Rafe's voice that Cale couldn't name at the time. It was Morrow Vane who had made the suggestion. Morrow, who had been inside the inner circle for 4 years. Morrow, who moved through the estate like he owned a piece of it. Morrow, who had access to those same routes. Who had motive Cale only learned about later. Who had handed Rafe a story so clean, so lined up with the evidence that Rafe had taken it. Morrow had pointed at Cale. Not loudly, quietly, the way a man who knows what he's doing works. He'd planted a thread. Let it unravel on its own. He didn't need to accuse, he just had to position the doubt so that when Rafe reached for an explanation, Cale's name was already sitting there, waiting. And Rafe, who trusted his counsel, who read patterns, who was not a man easily fooled, had reached for it. That was the part that sat in Cale's chest like a stone he couldn't put down. Rafe hadn't come to him, hadn't asked, hadn't given him a room in that conversation. He'd made the decision with incomplete information and called it strategy. Now, sitting in the guest room of the New York estate, Cale turned that over again. He remembered the day before he was sent away. The rushed packing. The "this is for you" explanation that felt hollow. The way Rafe had held him at the door for just a second longer than normal, and Cale had read it as love. It was guilt. He understood that now. And then, the memory that had been sitting at the edges of his mind for days surfaced fully. 3 weeks after arriving at the Georgia property, a doctor's visit, an assistant who'd come in with quiet eyes and a folded piece of paper. The words, "There were complications. We're so sorry." The grief that had leveled him for days. He was told the baby didn't survive. He had mourned. He had grieved alone in that house by the water. For 2 weeks, he had believed his child was gone. But Dante was here, breathing, warm, real. Someone had lied to him. Not about the route. Not about the exile. About his child. Cale pressed his back against the headboard and stared at the ceiling. If Morrow had built the story that sent him away, how far had that story gone? Had Morrow known about the pregnancy? Had someone paid that doctor? The ceiling didn't give him answers. But his gut did. And his gut said, this started earlier than one leaked route. This had been planned. Rafe's jet landed at JFK at 11:42 p.m. He moved fast through the terminal. No press. Private exit. The car was already waiting and his phone was already in his hand before he hit the back seat. 12 hours in Chicago. 3 failed meetings. A council member he no longer trusted. He was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. He told his head of security, Brennan Oakes, to pull the file on Morrow Vane the moment they cleared the tarmac. Something was wrong. He'd known it for weeks. The way a splinter sits in your palm before you can see it. Irritating without a source. He'd been moving on instinct, and instinct said Morrow's story had holes in it that he'd been too angry 6 months ago to examine. He wasn't too angry anymore. He was precise now. Brennan handed over the preliminary file in the car. Cale scrolled. Morrow's communications. Financial records that didn't line up with his stated salary. 3 overseas transfers in the month before the convoy was compromised. Cale hadn't paid for those. His jaw tightened. He'd made a decision 6 months ago based on a story someone else had written. He'd moved fast. He'd protected the estate. He'd sent Cale away and told himself it was necessary and not cruel, that there was a difference between exile and safety, that a man of his position couldn't afford sentimentality when the facts were on the table. Except the facts hadn't been facts. They'd been a setup. The car pulled onto the highway and Rafe stared at the city lights bleeding past the window. 3 weeks into Georgia, his assistant, Priya, had called him. Quiet voice. She said there had been complications with the pregnancy. She said Cale had been devastated. She said it was better not to reach out immediately. That space was what Cale needed. That any contact would only make the grief worse. He had believed her. He had grieved alone too, in a way he hadn't told anyone. He had sat in his office with the door locked and let himself feel it for exactly one night. Then he had sealed it up and kept moving, the way men in his position had been trained to do. He had never stopped to ask who had told Priya. Now he was asking. Brennan placed a second folder on the seat. Inside, A copy of the private estate's visitor logs from the Georgia property, cross-referenced with a name Rafe had not expected to see there. Morrow Vane. 3 visits in the first month of Cale's stay. Before the complications. Rafe's hand went still on the page. The pieces weren't connecting slowly anymore. They were snapping into place fast and hard, and each one landed worse than the one before it. He'd been told the baby didn't survive. He had believed it. He had carried it. But Brennan had pulled records from the estate's medical log that evening, and there was no record of a miscarriage, no emergency visit, no hospital transfer, no documentation of any kind. There was, however, a discharge note dated 2 weeks after the alleged loss. Routine. Healthy. A healthy child. Departed from Georgia with Cale. Travel destination unspecified. Rafe closed the folder. He didn't speak for the remainder of the ride. When the car turned through the gates of the New York estate, the front windows were lit. The house was quiet but awake. And when Rafe stepped out of the car, the first thing he heard, faint through the upstairs window of the guest wing, was a baby crying. Not the ghost of grief. Not memory. Real. Alive. He stood completely still in the driveway. His whole chest restructured itself around that sound. And then something else. A light in the guest room window, shifting, the shadow of someone moving behind the curtain, arms rocking. Cale. Cale was here. Rafe's security lead said his name twice before he answered. He didn't hear the second time. He was already moving toward the door. Cale heard the car. He was standing at the window, Dante on his shoulder, doing slow circles in the small space between the bed and the dresser, the only routine that quieted the baby at this hour. He heard gravel, then doors, then the low exchange of voices that moved through the night air the way Rafe's voice always moved, like it expected to be heard. He stopped walking. His heartbeat didn't panic. It sharpened. He had known this moment was coming. He had thought about it on the plane, in the car, in the quiet stretch of hours before sleep had refused to show up. He had run through versions of it. The confrontation he would demand. The silence he would hold. The words he would make cold and precise and untouchable so they landed right. None of those versions involved standing in a guest room in bare feet with a 6-week-old on his shoulder. Dante made a small sound against his neck. Cale pressed his hand flat against the baby's back and stayed still. Footsteps in the hall. Pausing outside the door. A knock. Not aggressive. Not entitled. Just a knock. That alone was unexpected. Rafe did not knock on doors inside his own estate. He moved through this house like every wall in it answered to him. Cale waited 3 seconds. Then he turned and crossed to the door and opened it. Rafe stood in the hallway in his travel clothes. Dark jacket. Open collar. Eyes that had done something in the hours since whatever Cale imagined had happened. They dropped the armor. Not all of it. Not even most of it. But enough that Cale could see something underneath. Neither of them spoke first. Dante shifted and made another small sound. Rafe's gaze moved from Cale's face to the baby. And something in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like a fault line giving way. Broke open briefly before he pulled it back. "Can I come in?" Rafe said. For words. That was already more than Cale had expected. He stepped back and let him in. The room felt smaller with Rafe in it. Everything about him was designed to take up space. Not rudely, just factually, the way a fire takes up a room whether it means to or not. He stood near the center and looked at Cale and didn't reach for anything. "You heard the call," Rafe said. Not a question. "I heard enough," Cale said. A pause. Real. Waited. "I'm looking in tomorrow," Rafe said. Cale's jaw shifted. That was not the apology. That was not even close to the apology. But Cale had decided something on that plane. He was not going to perform fury for the sake of it. He was not going to make this a scene that felt satisfying in the moment and solved nothing. He had watched enough men in this world use emotion as a deflection, weaponize tears to avoid accountability, turn confrontation into chaos so that the original wound got buried. He was not going to do that. "Good," Cale said. "Start with Georgia. Start with who told Priya. Start with every visit Morrow made to that property. Rafe looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt. Deeper than that. You know about Georgia, he said. I know what I was told happened there, Cale said. And I know it was a lie. Dante stirred. Cale bounced him slightly, automatically, without looking down. His eyes stayed on Rafe. Rafe exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that carries weight. Not relief, not annoyance, just a man releasing something he's been holding at a wrong angle for too long. I should have come to you, he said, before I made the decision. Yes, Cale said. Just that. No explosion. No collapse. Just yes, clean and true, and landing with more weight than any shouted accusation would have carried. Rafe looked at his son. At the way Dante's small fist had found the fabric of Cale's sleeve and gripped it. I want to fix this, he said. Cale looked at him for a long time. He thought about 6 months alone. He thought about a doctor's folded piece of paper. He thought about grief that shouldn't have existed. He thought about a word. Relocate, spoken over his child like a logistical problem. He thought about every version of this man that he had loved, and still loved, and what loving someone who had hurt you this deeply actually asked of a person. Wanting to fix it, Cale said quietly, is only the beginning. He turned back to the window, still rocking Dante. And Rafe stayed in the room. Didn't speak. Didn't reach. Just stayed. Which, for the first time in a long time, felt like something Cale hadn't known he was waiting for. But by morning, Cale would find something in Dante's medical bag that Rafe hadn't put there. A folded note. For words in handwriting Cale didn't recognize. He's not done yet. The note had 4 words. He's not done yet. Cale read it twice. Then he folded it and pressed it flat against his palm like pressure could help him think. He stood in the gray morning light of the guest room, Dante asleep in the travel crib 3 feet away, and he looked at the handwriting again. Not Rafe's, not Tycho's, not Soren's. Someone else had been inside this room. That meant someone had access. Someone on staff. Someone inside the gates. Someone who knew which room Cale was staying in, and had gotten close enough to slip a note into a baby bag without being seen. That was not a warning from a stranger. That was a warning from someone watching. He called Brennan Oakes at 6:14 a.m., kept his voice flat. Told him what he found. Brennan arrived in 12 minutes, which said something about how serious Brennan was taking the situation. By 7 a.m., the guest wing was being swept. By 8 a.m., Rafe knew. He came to the doorway of the room with the note already in his hand. Brennan had photographed it, passed it up the chain fast. He looked at Cale, and for once there was no management in his expression. No calculation, just something stripped back and raw. You were never safe here, Rafe said. No, Cale said. I wasn't. That landed. Hard. On both of them. The investigation into Morrow Vane had already begun the night before, but this shifted the scope. This wasn't about a leaked route anymore. This wasn't about one man's loyalty being compromised. Someone had been running a longer game, and Morrow had been one piece of it. Brennan's team pulled the full visitor record. Cross-referenced estate staff against Morrow's financial transfers. Took 3 hours. The name that came back was Lexon Pruitt, head of overnight security. 6 years with the estate. Decorated record. Absolutely trusted. Rafe read the name and didn't speak for 30 seconds. That's how betrayal works in these circles. It doesn't come from the obvious threat. It comes from the chair at the table you never questioned. Lexon had been feeding Morrow information for 14 months. Route schedules. Personal calendars. Cale's medical appointments. The Georgia address. Priya's direct line. Everything Morrow had needed to build the story that dismantled Cale's position in this house. Lexon had provided. And the fake miscarriage report? Lexon had arranged the doctor. Had arranged the folded paper. Had made sure the grief landed cleanly so that nobody would question why Cale stayed in Georgia so long. Pause on that. A healthy baby. A mourning husband. A fabricated death. Designed to separate a father from his child while the Real plan moved forward. What was the real plan? That took until afternoon. Morrow had a buyer. a rival faction that had been trying to dismantle Rafe's council from the inside for 2 years. Morrow's plan wasn't just about loyalty. It was about positioning. If Kale, who had spent years building quiet alliances with neutral parties through exactly the kind of soft diplomacy Soren had dismissed on that call, was removed from the picture, the council's emotional intelligence walked out with him. The factions Kale had kept steady would drift. The rival group would move in. It was a long play, patient, quiet, and it had almost worked. Rafe called a council meeting at 4 p.m. Kale was in the room. Not as a courtesy, not as a symbolic gesture. Rafe pulled out his chair, set the file on the table, and said, clearly to everyone present, "He stays. He's heard. That's done." Nobody argued. Lexon was arrested by evening. Morrow's location was traced to a hotel in Philadelphia. An extraction team was already moving. But Kale knew the moment Morrow was in custody, the real questions would start. Why had the rival faction wanted him gone specifically? What did they know about Dante that Kale didn't yet? Morrow Vane was brought in on a Thursday. He looked smaller in person than the version Kale had built in his mind over the past 48 hours. Medium height, neat clothes. The kind of face that reads instantly as reasonable, which was exactly the point, exactly the tool, exactly why he had lasted as long as he had inside this world. Kale didn't attend the interrogation. He didn't ask to. He sat in the kitchen with Dante on the activity mat and listened to the house breathe around him. Soren came in at some point and made coffee without asking if Kale wanted any. Just set a mug on the counter within reach. Said nothing. Sat down across the table with his own. That was something. Not an apology. Not even close to one. But it was the first time in months Soren had occupied the same space as Kale without either managing it or exiting it. Just sitting. Present. Kale wrapped both hands around the mug. "You knew I was in Georgia for too long," he said. Not an accusation. A fact. Soren's jaw moved. He looked at the table. "I asked Rafe about it twice." "What did he say?" "That you needed space." Kale nodded slowly. He believed that. He believed Soren had asked. He also understood that asking once and accepting the answer wasn't the same as pushing back. And Soren was not the kind of man who pushed back on Rafe when Rafe had already decided. "That's something you'll have to sit with," Kale said. Soren nodded. He didn't argue. He just nodded and drank his coffee and stayed at the table. That was the first real moment. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just two people in a kitchen choosing not to walk away from an uncomfortable truth. Trust doesn't rebuild in speeches. It rebuilds in moments exactly that quiet. Tycho came in that evening. Different energy entirely. Tycho was not a man comfortable with uncertainty. Everything about him was built for execution, for reading a room fast and controlling the variables. Vulnerability was not part of his vocabulary, which made what he did in that hallway outside the guest room remarkable. He knocked. Kale answered. And Tycho stood there with his hands in his pockets and said, "I owe you more than I've given you." 7 words. Not a full accounting. Not a detailed breakdown of every moment he'd looked at Rafe across a table while Kale sat unheard. But it was real. There was no posturing in it. No performance. Kale looked at him for a long moment. "Start showing up differently," Kale said. "That's what I need." Not a speech. Tycho nodded once. Walked away. And 3 hours later, when the council convened again to review Morrow's full statement, Tycho specifically asked the room to hear Kale's read on which neutral factions were most at risk in the fallout. The room listened. Kale spoke for 11 minutes. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. He laid out 4 factions, 2 vulnerabilities, and 1 immediate action that would stabilize the most volatile relationship before the week was out. Rafe didn't interrupt him once. When Kale finished, there was a pause. Then Rafe said, "That's where we start." Kale looked at his hands under the table. Something loosened in his chest, small, but real. This wasn't healed. He knew that. You don't fix 14 months of quiet exclusion in 72 hours of crisis. You don't rebuild trust with a few good moments inside a bad situation. But this was different from what it had been. And different was worth something. Dante had started making new sounds that week. Not crying. More exploratory. Little vowels and soft clicks that he aimed at whoever was nearest. When Rafe came into the room that evening and sat on the floor beside the mat, not in a chair on the floor, Dante aimed one of those sounds directly at him. Rafe went completely still. Then he reached out slowly and let Dante wrap one fist around his index finger. He didn't look up. He just stayed there. Kale stood in the doorway and watched, and didn't say a word. Some things don't need words. It was past midnight when Kale couldn't sleep. That wasn't new. Sleep had been complicated since Georgia. Since long before Georgia, honestly. He'd learned to stop fighting it, to just get up, move through the house quietly, let the nighttime do its thing. He found Rafe at the kitchen table. No lights on except the one above the stove. A glass of water. A folder closed on the table that Rafe wasn't reading. Just sitting in the way men sit when they're too tired to be anything. Kale pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. No greeting. No preamble. They stayed like that for almost a minute. "I keep going back to the day I sent you away," Rafe said finally. "I know," Kale said. "I was convinced." He turned the glass once on the table. Morrow didn't even have to push hard. One conversation. A few numbers. The timeline lined up and He stopped. "You wanted it to be someone," Kale said. "And I was there." Rafe looked at him. Something in his eyes broke open for just a second before he steadied it. "That's not a defense," he said. "I know it isn't. I'm not trying to make it one." "I know that too," Kale said. The kitchen held them both. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do at 1 a.m. Not sleeping exactly, just shifting. Quieter lights. Slower movements. "You folded baby clothes the whole time," Rafe said suddenly. Kale frowned. "What?" "On the jet. Before you heard the call." He wasn't looking away now. Brennan reviewed the flight footage. Camera in the main cabin. "You were folding those clothes for 40 minutes. Even when Dante wouldn't stop crying. You just kept folding." Kale didn't know what to do with that. He hadn't thought about it as anything. It was just what his hands had needed to do. "Brennan shouldn't be watching me fold laundry," Kale said. Rafe almost smiled. Almost. "He watches everything. It's annoying. It's also why we're all alive." A beat. "The clothes were for Dante," Kale said. "I pack when I'm scared. Always have. If my hands are doing something useful, my brain doesn't go to the worst place." Rafe absorbed that like he was memorizing it. "I didn't know that about you," he said. "You didn't ask," Kale said. Quietly. No edge in it. Just true. That hung between them. Rafe didn't deflect it. Didn't minimize it. He just let it be true. "I want to ask now," he said. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't the kind of line that lands in movies. Swelling music, the right lighting, a moment designed to be felt. It was a man at a kitchen table in the dark saying the plainest, most honest thing he'd said in years. And Kale felt it exactly where Rafe meant him to feel it. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't close the distance. He wasn't ready for that. And Rafe, to his credit, didn't move toward him either. But he answered. "I'm afraid you'll go back," Kale said. "When this crisis is over. When Morrow's dealt with and the factions settle and it all feels normal again. I'm afraid you'll go back to the version of this marriage where I'm managed instead of included. Where keeping me safe means keeping me quiet." Rafe didn't rush to reassure him. He sat with it. That was the right thing to do. "I'm afraid of that too," Rafe said. Kale looked at him. "Not of doing it consciously," Rafe said. "Of doing it without realizing. Of waking up 6 months from now and finding out I slipped back because it was easier. Because this is how I learned to operate and I haven't learned a different way yet." He paused. "That scares me. Honesty without armor is a hard thing to witness. Especially from a man who has worn armor so long he's forgotten it's there." Kale stood after a while. He picked up Rafe's empty glass and set it in the sink. He paused at the edge of the kitchen. "Learn the different way," he said. "That's all I'm asking." He went back upstairs. Rafe sat alone in the kitchen for another hour. But when morning came, Kale found a handwritten note, Rafe's handwriting, on the counter beside the coffee maker. 6 words. I'll start learning. Don't give up. Kale folded it and put it in his pocket. He didn't answer yet, but he kept it. For weeks after Morrovain was handed over to the council's justice process, something shifted. Not all at once. Not loudly. The way seasons shift. You don't feel the exact moment it changes, you just look up one day and realize the light is different. Rafe started small. He asked before scheduling anything that involved Kale. Not informing, asking. A different word. A different posture. The first time he did it, Kale had stopped mid-sentence and looked at him. Rafe had looked back, patient, waiting. And Kale had answered. The security briefings started including him again. Not as a courtesy, as a voice. Rafe introduced him to 3 council members he'd never formally met, and he did it plainly. You need to know his read on Faction 7. It's better than mine. That sentence moved through Kale in a way he hadn't been ready for. Tycho started doing something new at council. When a topic came up that touched the emotional dynamics of an alliance, a negotiation that was stalling, a relationship that needed managing, he would look across the table at Kale before offering his own read. Not deferring completely, just checking, including. Sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. Soren made dinner 3 times that week. Not for performance. He just cooked. Showed up in the kitchen at 6 p.m. with ingredients and no announcement, and an hour later there was food. He didn't make a moment of it. Just set the table and called everyone. The first time it happened, Kale sat across from all 3 of them, Dante in the high chair at the end of the table, and realized he hadn't eaten a meal with all of them in over a year. He cut his food. Dante slapped the tray happily. Soren said something dry about the chicken and Tycho corrected him, and Rafe shook his head slowly, and for one brief moment it just felt like people. Not empire. Not strategy. Not managed relationships and closed doors and folded maps. People. Kale let himself feel that without immediately bracing for what came next. That was growth too. The accountability wasn't just private. That mattered. Rafe stood in front of 2 neutral faction leaders, the very ones Kale had flagged in his council statement, and acknowledged that their alliance had weakened during the past year because of decisions made without adequate input. He didn't perform humility. He just said plainly that the process had failed and that the process was being corrected. One of the faction leaders, an older woman named Celestine Burke, who had known Rafe for 12 years and did not impress easily, looked across the table at Kale afterward. You've been here the whole time, she said. Yes, Kale said. Good, she said. Don't stop. The thing about redemption in real life is that it doesn't have a moment where the music swells and the scene fades to warm light. It's mostly in the doing. Every day choosing differently than the day before, without applause, without an audience, without anyone guaranteeing that the effort will be enough. Rafe was doing that. Kale was watching. He was watching carefully, not suspiciously, not from behind walls, but with open eyes. Because loving someone and being careful are not opposites. You can love fully and still pay attention. You can forgive and still remember what you learned. That Friday night, Rafe came to the guest room doorway. Not to apologize again. Not to make another speech or another note or another gesture. He just asked, "Do you want to come back to our room?" Not a demand. Not an assumption. A question. Open. His voice quiet. Kale looked at him for a long moment. "Not yet," he said. Rafe nodded. "Okay." And he left. No pressure. No wounded silence trailing behind him. Just okay, and the door left slightly open. Kale stood there after he left, hand resting on the doorframe. Not yet was a no. And Rafe knew that. The morning Dante turned 3 months old, Kale moved back. No announcement. He'd carried a few things down the hall the night before, quietly, while Dante slept. He'd woken early, made the last small transfer of items, and by the time Rafe came downstairs, it was done. Kale was in the kitchen with Dante on his hip and coffee already made. Rafe stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looked at Kale, looked at the room. At the small stack of Dante's toys on the main counter that hadn't been there yesterday. At the baby monitor on the kitchen shelf. He didn't say anything. Cale handed him a mug. Rafe took it. Their fingers didn't overlap. They didn't have to. That was enough. Life didn't become simple. It didn't go clean. The council still had problems. Two factions remained unstable. The Lex and Pruitt fallout left a gap in overnight security that took weeks to properly fill. There were meetings that ran long. Decisions that had to be walked back. At least 2 evenings where the tension in a room between Rafe and Tycho could have been cut with something. And Cale was the one who diffused it, not because it was his job, but because he was good at it and he chose to use that. He chose to use it. That mattered to him. The choosing. He wasn't folding laundry in the corner anymore. He was at the table. Soren taught Dante the word for spoon. Or tried to, in the nonsense half-language people use with babies, tapping the handle against the tray. Dante responded by trying to put the whole thing in his mouth. Soren narrated the attempt in a voice entirely too serious for the situation, and somehow that became a thing. Soren doing a quiet play-by-play of every meal, addressing Dante like a tiny sportscaster would address an audience. Cale laughed. Really laughed. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of his own laughter until he heard it. Tycho, for his part, became the one who handled the overnight shifts without being asked. He didn't make a show of it. He just appeared in the doorway at 2 a.m. when Dante woke, would look at Cale and say go back to sleep in his flat, efficient way. And Cale, who had spent months sleeping light and staying alert, started to sleep. Really sleep. That was the truest sign. You don't actually rest around people you don't trust. And one night, one particular Wednesday night when the house was quiet and Dante had gone down easily, and there was no crisis on the horizon for once. Rafe and Cale sat on the back terrace. City below. Sky above. Not talking about the council or the factions or any of it. Just sitting. Rafe said at some point, I think about what this almost became. Cale didn't ask him to explain. He knew what it almost became. A marriage that hollowed out from the inside while everyone kept calling it protection. A child raised without one parent present. A man who gave everything and was quietly handed a smaller and smaller role until one day there was no role left. It didn't, Cale said. Because you didn't let it, Rafe said. Because you didn't let it either. Cale looked at him. Eventually, a pause. The city moved below them. I keep the note, Cale said. The one from the kitchen counter. Rafe was quiet for a moment. Then, you kept it. In my pocket. For a while. Now it's in the top drawer. He looked at the lights below. It reminded me that you were trying. On the days when trying felt like not enough. It reminded me. Love doesn't erase what happened. That's not how love works. It doesn't rewrite the months in Georgia or the folded map or the word relocate spoken over a sleeping child. It doesn't undo Morrow Vane or Lex and Pruitt or the folded paper from a doctor who'd been paid to deliver grief. What it does, if it's real, if both people are willing, is grow around those things. Like a tree growing around a scar in its bark. The mark stays. The tree keeps going. They weren't finished. Cale knew that. Rafe knew that. There would be harder weeks ahead. There would be moments when old patterns showed up uninvited. When a door got closed before it should. When a decision moved faster than a conversation. When someone's voice got smaller in a room full of bigger ones. But now there was language for it. Now there was a table where Cale sat at the center, not the edge. Now there was a man who asked before he assumed, who heard the answer, who stayed in the room when the answer was hard. That Friday, Celestine Burke sent a handwritten letter to the estate. It was addressed to Cale. 3 lines. She wrote that the council's stability had improved noticeably in the past 30 days. That the faction relationships Cale had flagged were already showing signs of repair. And that she hoped he intended to stay. Cale read it twice, folded it, set it on the desk in the study, the main study, not the guest room. His desk now. Dante pulled himself up against the edge of it an hour later, unsteady, gripping the wood with both small hands, looking at Cale with the expression babies make when they have just discovered something enormous. Like standing. Like the ground is right there and your legs are right there and maybe this is what they're for. Kale crouched down and held out both hands. Dante let go of the desk. One step, unsteady, then another. He made it 3 steps before he sat down hard on the rug, looked at his own hands like they had personally surprised him, and then looked up at Kale with a face full of delight. Kale sat on the floor beside him. He was still there when Rafe walked in 20 minutes later and found them both on the rug, Dante attempting the same 3 steps in a new direction, Kale watching with the full weight of his attention. Rafe sat down on the floor too. No chair, no desk between them, no door. Just the 3 of them on the floor, watching something small and determined take its first steps. Healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it shows up on a rug on a Friday afternoon. It whispers, and that is enough. If the story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next story coming to this channel. Every story we share here is about real choices, love, strength, rebuilding, and what it actually takes to rise. Drop a comment below and tell us, what part of this story hit you hardest? Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.